What's up everybody? So in this video we're going to be doing some questions on the topic 2.3. So this is everything to do with carbohydrates and lipids. So let's just get started. The diagram shows the structure of palmitic acid, and then they give you a picture here of palmitic acid. So don't worry, if you haven't heard ever of the word palmitic acid, you don't have it's not going to affect your ability to do this question. In the IB, they don't teach you about palmitic acid specifically, okay? But if you understand this topic in general, 2.3, you should still be able to answer it just by knowing the structure of this molecule, because they give you the structure of palmitic acid, right? So let's just read the options. What type of fatty acid is palmitic acid? Okay, so we can see here A, it's monounsaturated, B, it's polyunsaturated, C, it's saturated, D, it's trans fatty acid. Okay, so for the sake of this video, I'm not going to explain in great detail what's going on here exactly, okay? I'm going to give you some small guidance, otherwise this video would become way too long, okay? So if you don't understand anything related to fats or carbohydrates, you first need to watch the teaching videos that I made, okay? Then I recommend you come back. Otherwise, you may not understand any of the options here. In essence, what you need to know for this question is that this is the basic structure of a fatty acid. It's a long chain of carbons, and at the end, there's this carboxyl group, okay? The C double bonded to an O, and then an OH group, okay? That's the basic structure of a fatty acid. Now, we call a fatty acid saturated if it is binding to as many hydrogens as possible, okay? If it is binding to as many hydrogens as possible. Now, a carbon can have 4 bonds, which means it can bind to, a carbon always has 4 bonds. So you can see here, this carbon is binding to 3 hydrogens and 1 carbon. This carbon is binding to 2 hydrogens and 2 carbons, and so on. Now, you can see right now the carbons are binding to as many hydrogens as possible, okay? They're using all of their bonds possible to make hydrogen bonds, and then the only other bond is to connect to this subsequent carbon, okay? But sometimes what happens is the carbons, instead of binding to 4 separate molecules like what's happening here, sometimes they make a double bond. So you can see this carbon is making a double bond to another carbon. This means that both of these carbons aren't binding to as many hydrogens as possible, because before they used this bond to bind to a hydrogen, right? But now they're using this bond to bind to each other. This molecule isn't binding to as many hydrogens as it possibly can, so we call it unsaturated. Unsaturated. And there, let me show you. Give me a second. Okay, basically, we call a molecule polyunsaturated if it has many of these double bonds. So you can see this one has more than one double bond here, okay? So it is polyunsaturated. But if a molecule, a fatty acid, only has one double bond somewhere, we call it monounsaturated. Both of these, poly and monounsaturated, falls under the category of unsaturated, okay, because it's not binding to as many hydrogens as possible. Now, the double bond can happen in 2 ways. So you can have one example is the double bond happens between the 2 carbons, and both hydrogens that it's binding to is on the same side. We call that cis-unsaturated. And another example is when the carbons are binding to each other by a double bond and one hydrogen is on the other end and one hydrogen is on this end. We call that trans, okay, trans. That's the basics of what you need to know regarding fatty acids, okay? So do you think this molecule here is monounsaturated? No, I don't see any double bonds here. This molecule is binding to as many hydrogens as possible. Okay, so it is going to be saturated. It is not monounsaturated, not polyunsaturated, but saturated. Okay, it's going to be C. Why not D? Because D is implying that the molecule is unsaturated, right? Because to be trans fatty acid, it means you must have one double bond somewhere. You must be unsaturated. So the answer here will be C. Okay, so don't freak out when you see palmitic acid and be like, oh, I didn't learn about that. Okay, you don't need to know it. All you need to do is pay attention to this structure. Okay, next one. Which type of reaction is the breakdown of starch into sugars? Okay, breakdown. So breakdown. We know in this topic we learned about two things: formation and breakdown. Okay, formation and breakdown. Now we know. Let me show you something here. We know that we can basically, in our cells, for example, our liver cell, we can put together a bunch of glucoses, right? Just like this, bind them together, and this forms a structure called glycogen, right? This is a way of storing our glucoses, otherwise they just float around randomly. We store them like this. This is an example of an anabolic reaction because we're adding the things together, okay? We're making a bigger molecule. If we take this molecule and break it apart into the individual glucoses, that is a catabolic reaction, okay? So this is the two types of reactions you need to know. Now, if we break down a starch is basically the same thing as a glycogen, but in plants, okay? So glycogen is what we find in animals, how glucose is stored in animals, but starch is how glucose is stored in plants, okay? So what do we call the breakdown of starch into the individual sugars? This is going to be a catabolic reaction, as I just mentioned. You're breaking something down. You can think of this in terms of a cat. A cat likes to destroy your curtains, your couch, okay? They break things apart. So a catabolic reaction is a breakdown reaction, okay? So it's going to be C, but why not the rest? Okay, A is denaturation. Denaturation applies to proteins, okay? When you put a protein into too much heat or acid or something like this, you can denature it. But I'm not going to explain what this means. Just know denature doesn't apply to the breakdown of starch into sugars. Reduction is another process, which I'm not going to explain here, but it's not related to the breakdown of starch into sugars. Okay, so it's going to be catabolic. Condensation reaction is a type of anabolic reaction. So a condensation reaction is a type of reaction that involves creating a bond, okay? It's a condensation reaction. So it's a type of anabolic reaction, not a catabolic reaction. So that's why the answer is C. Okay, next one. The diagram shows a molecular structure. Again, they're showing you the structure. Now, this is one that you have to be familiar with, okay? You have to be familiar with it. So is this an amino acid? No, it's not an amino acid. We know an amino acid has a completely different structure than this, okay? Is this a lipid? Yes, it's a lipid, okay? But you might be confused why it is not a carbohydrate because it looks a lot like the glucoses, right? If you look at the structure, it looks a lot like the glucoses. Now, this is true. You might be confused about this, but the reason why this molecule is classified under lipids is because it behaves like a lipid. Although it looks like a carbohydrate, it behaves like a lipid. What does a lipid do? A lipid cannot dissolve in water, right? If you put oil in water, it will float near the top, right? It doesn't dissolve. That's the same with this structure here. Okay, this structure is very hydrophobic. So that's why we classified under the category of lipid. Now, what molecule is this? This is a steroid molecule. Any molecule that has these four ring structure here is called a steroid molecule. Specifically, this is cholesterol, okay? This group here, this chain here, added to this to the steroid molecule makes it a cholesterol. Okay, so cholesterol is a molecule that is found in the membrane, right? The membrane of cells, okay, to help it be more fluid. Okay, so again, this is something that if you don't recognize this molecule, you probably won't get this question right. You just need to remember this. Remember this structure. This is a cholesterol molecule, but these four rings classified as a steroid, and we know a steroid or a cholesterol is classified as a lipid. Okay, so this is a tough one. If you can't like use logic to explain this right here. Okay, you need to simply remember this structure. Next one, which molecule is a sugar? So is it A, B, C, or D? So we know here A is a ribose. A ribose is a ring-like structure like this that's made up of 5 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? If it was made up of 6 carbons, it'd be what? A glucose, right? A glucose molecule. But this is a ribose. It's 5 carbons. So any molecule that ends in ose, like ribose or glucose, that's considered a sugar. Okay, so it's going to be A. B, again, this is the exact same molecule we saw up here. This is a cholesterol, okay, or a lipid molecule. This right here is a protein, right? It's an amino acid. It's got the N C and C, the carboxyl group and the amino group and the R group. This is a amino acid. And this last one here is the super long chain of carbons. Again, this is what is this one? This one is saturated. Again, no double bond. So it's a saturated fatty acid. So the answer here is going to be A. Okay, so you can see to be able to answer these questions, a lot of the time you need to be not only good at carbohydrates and lipids, but you must also be aware of what the proteins are, okay? So you got to mix your knowledge. Okay, next one. Which always contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen? Carbohydrate, protein, or fat? Or all of them? What is it? So let's look at a carbohydrate. So this right here is a carbohydrate. Does it have a carbon, a hydrogen, and an oxygen? Yes, it does. So technically this is right. What about this one here? The protein. Does it have a carbohydrate, a carbon, hydrogen, oxygen? Yes, it does. A carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So technically this one as well. What about fat? So let's look at this fatty acid. Yes, it also has an oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. So the answer will be 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so again, you need to know about all of them. Even if you knew about carbohydrates and fats here and didn't know about protein, maybe you would have said 1 and 3 and got it wrong. So it's important to know about all of them. That in the IB they will mix up the different topics to see if you really know what you're doing. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'll make another part on this video. So check that one out next. The more questions you can do, the better. Your teachers will take these questions directly into your topic tests.